Welcome back, everybody. A while ago I did a video where I summarized an article called At a Loss for Words. It was all about reading instruction and phonics, and it's by far my most popular video here on YouTube. So I thought, since everyone seemed really interested in that kind of information, that I would look at the reference list of that article and read up on all of the research that formed that article. Because yes, I think that cross-referencing a reference list is a great way to spend my time. When I was pregnant and you have like your baby shower, my university roommates got me a whole bundle of little baby books as a gift. Obviously, I love books, but they wrote an annotated bibliography for all of the books to give to me, and it's one of my favorite gifts. I cannot believe how thoughtful and sweet and on point it was for who I am. I love a good reference list. Well, hi, I'm Courtney. Welcome to my channel where I summarize educational research one study at a time so that you can incorporate it into your practice. All right, so with all of that said, today we are summarizing Reading Recovery's Unrecovered Learners, Characteristics and Issues. Reading Recovery was developed in New Zealand in the 70s, and it was meant to target students who weren't succeeding in reading. So it was a program designed to recover students who were struggling. And it was created so that the bottom 15 to 20% of any school would send their kids to this reading recovery program within the school. There would be a trained teacher. The teacher would work one-on-one with students for 30 minutes a day for 12 to 20-ish weeks. And by the end of the program, the goal is that that student would enter back into the classroom seamlessly and read alongside their peers, and we wouldn't have a reading issue. This program says that about 75% of students should be back on track with their peers by the time they're done. So this paper that I'm reading is looking at the 25% that didn't pass the program. They were unrecovered. Reading Recovery was developed to work alongside whole language. So that's a problem off the hop. And it was developed in New Zealand when whole language was the way to go. Now, when Reading Recovery moved to other countries, some of those countries said, well, we don't use whole language, we teach phonics. And the creator, Marie Clay, said, no problem, don't worry. It will be fine for that too, even though the philosophies on how they're teaching children to read are completely different. So how are you going to recover somebody when they haven't learned the way that you're teaching them? But anyways, she said it'll be fine. And the countries that adopted the program said, perfect, sign us up. The creator of the program, Marie Clay, said that the most important question to ask when students are reading is, does this make sense? So of course we want students to be able to understand what they're reading, but before they can necessarily understand what they're reading and make meaning and make sense of everything, they have to be able to read. Let me demonstrate, 1 second. Okay, in whole language this works. We can look at the picture, we can look at the word cat, cat, it matches. Yay, I can read because I can look at the picture. The problem is, what if I did this? I turned my picture of a cat into a bunny. The words didn't change though. Magically, even though the picture changed, the word is still cat. You can't just say, does it make sense? No, it doesn't make sense that there's a picture of a bunny with the word cat. That doesn't make sense. But that doesn't mean that the letters magically changed and now the whole thing says bunny. That is not how reading works. That's how guessing works. Can you imagine how frustrating it must be for people who have learned whole language to read a contract where it's just all text and there is no sense of meaning? Like, it's funny to think about, but then I'm also horrified because it leaves people incredibly vulnerable to be taken advantage of. Okay, so back to the paper. Reading Recovery targets students at the word level, but what research shows us is that when students enter into Reading Recovery after their 1 year of instruction that didn't go so well for them, they're not even at the word level of reading. They're still trying to make letter sound connections. And so Reading Recovery doesn't help them with that. My favorite phrase of this article is, The primary characteristic of developmental reading problems is poor context-free word recognition ability and associated phonological processing difficulties. So if we know that lack of phonics is the problem, then why aren't we teaching kids phonics instead of whole language to recover them? In New Zealand, they rolled out reading recovery with hardly any research, and then it expanded to England because two inspectors came to observe some classrooms that were using reading recovery, and they decided, yeah, this'll work, and they took the program over to the UK. Just ask me how I feel about inspectors and superintendents and ministers of education not having a background in education research. I get it. I get the appeal of wanting so desperately to have something in place to help your students, especially from an equity perspective. And so if somebody comes along and says, hey, I can fix this for you, yes, take my money. I want all my students to be able to read. It's so important for them. But we can't just let students' reading abilities be subject to our whims because we didn't do our due diligence. This should have been studied and studied again and then reviewed, and then there should have been consultations with naysayers so that you can see why people might not approve of the program. If we're going to roll something out nationally, then we need to make sure we've done at least a little bit of background to see if it works or not. The authors then looked to other research which showed that 95% of students that were successful in reading recovery, so they did recover, were back down to the 23rd percentile in reading by the time they were in the 8 to 10 age group. And remember, reading recovery targets kids when they're around age 7. So the long-term effects did not stick, if there were any effects at all. The authors of the study also looked at research about teachers who put students into reading recovery. And this research shows that teachers didn't put their lowest performing kids into reading recovery because they knew that those kids wouldn't be successful. So the program is aimed at the lowest 15 to 20% performing students in your school, which is problematic because that's not a benchmark. That doesn't say if a student is at this level, they need reading recovery. Students in the bottom 15 to 20% at one school could be all readers compared to the 15-20% lowest in another school. So that's a weird cutoff and a weird way to do it. My suspicion is they're doing that because then no schools would be able to say we don't need reading recovery because everybody's going to have a bottom 15 to 20%. That's just how stats work. So I'm very skeptical of that cutoff. But anyways, teachers knew that their lowest performing students wouldn't do well in reading recovery, so they didn't put it in. So all of the data that we have about people who did recover from reading recovery is skewed. Okay, so let's look at the actual study that these authors did. In New Zealand, they gathered information from a monitoring report, and this report has two types of data: school level data and data on individual students. And so these reports get made from schools that use reading recovery, and the authors had access to those reports. The researchers noticed that schools that were in the lowest socioeconomic areas didn't have reading recovery in their schools. This is potentially because reading recovery has a cost associated with it. Now, in some low socioeconomic areas, they did have reading recovery, and in those cases, kids were in reading recovery a lot longer, so they weren't performing as well in reading recovery compared to schools in higher socioeconomic status neighborhoods. The authors state that in 2015, 36% of the 6-year-old population, so those kids who would be candidates for reading recovery, were Maori or Pacifica. However, when you look at reading recovery stats, those students, Maori and Pacifica students, make up 47% of the population involved in reading recovery. The 2015 data also reveals that 78% of students were successfully discontinued. So basically that means that they passed the program. They don't need to do it anymore. 14% were unrecovered, and then 6% left the school or they lost their data or something like that. And this was consistent from the previous 13 years. There's about 11 to 14% students who are not successful in the program. Here's where it gets more interesting though. Over half, so 54%, of those students that didn't recover, so of that 14%, over half of them that didn't recover are Maori or Pacifica students. And so now we have a huge equity problem here because we have a program that is showing that students who are Maori or Pacifica are not starting off on the same foot as students from other ethnic and cultural backgrounds. And when they're put in programs that's supposed to help them, the programs aren't serving them. We are just further marginalizing students by wasting their time. Then if we look at the school level, schools in low socioeconomic areas have an 18% unrecovery rate, and schools in higher socioeconomic areas only have a 10% unrecovered rate. So if we look just at who is not being served by this program, we can see that it's students from low socioeconomic areas who are racialized. And likely based on what I know, and the authors allude to this as well, is that there is an overlap there. When the authors looked at the entrance scores for who got into reading recovery and who didn't get out successfully, they noticed that students who didn't recover also had poor scores when it came to word reading, a reading record, and a writing assessment. So if we can just use these scores to predict who's not going to do well in reading recovery, why do we put students in reading recovery? Just give them the entrance assessments, look and see if they're low, and say, no, I'm not gonna put you in here, you're not gonna do well. Why are we wasting time and money putting kids in reading recovery when, I don't know, we could just, off the top of my head here, teach them how to read, teach them some phonics. Maybe that might help. There's a wonderful graph in this article that shows the entrance scores that students had and the exit scores, and there's overlap. So if you plot out the entrance scores of some students, they were higher than the average of students' exit scores. And that's again because the way the program works is you select the lowest 15 to 20% without benchmarking it. And so if you've got a school where everyone's an average reader, their entrance scores are going to be better than the whole sum of people leaving the program. And that is a problem. That is skewed data at its finest. The authors show that there's research about a false positive bias where a lot of students who did recover would have done so anyways without the intervention at all. But oh friends, it gets so much better. If you look at the reading recovery group, there's a reading score called the PIRLS, P-I-R-L-S, all caps, so I'm not sure if it's pronounced PIRLS or P-I-R-L-S, but anyways, 83% of the reading recovery group scored lower on that test than the average student who wasn't in reading recovery. And then students who received reading recovery were Maori or Pacifica and lived in low socioeconomic areas, or at least went to school in low socioeconomic areas, had an average PIRLS score that was 100 points below the average student who didn't have any reading intervention at all. So the gap is not closing here at all. It's just being perpetuated over and over and over. One of the big things that reading recovery really prides themselves in is that it's individual instruction, which is expensive because you're working one-on-one with students. But the authors of this article show research that states that you can actually work up to 3 kids at a time and have no difference in effects. So working one-on-one, working one-on-2, working one-on-3 leads to the same outcomes for students. That doesn't solve the problem though of this program being just ineffective in and of itself. Because there's research from places where whole language was used and where phonics were used, the researchers were able to compare that in this study. And shockingly, they found that the students who did reading recovery after learning phonics did a heck of a lot better than the students who learned whole language. In fact, they were 8 months further ahead in their reading age compared to their whole language counterparts. So reading recovery might be helpful for some students, but it's not helpful for the students that it claims to be helpful for. Reading recovery is supposed to help the bottom 15 to 20% of all students in all schools, and it's not doing that at all. A better approach would be to do targeted one-on-one or one-on-two or one-on-3 phonics-based instruction to help students get that early phonological awareness. Reading recovery also prides itself on the fact that the teacher who is in charge of administering the program is very heavily trained. But the authors of this study looked to a meta-analysis and found that paraprofessionals and even volunteers who learned a very systematic way to teach phonics instruction were just as effective in helping students catch up if they were behind in their reading abilities. So why is reading recovery still a thing if we know it doesn't work? Well, if we look to the business side of it, Marie Clay owns the program and owns the trademark to it, so it cannot be altered without her approval. When the New Zealand Ministry of Education said, hey, we have a few things here that we'd like to change, she said no. And this is very antithetical to the research process. I know that her bio talks about Marie Clay having all of this research background and everything, but the way the research process works is that you put something out there, people tell you it needs to be changed, you look at data, you compare it, you make changes. It's never a static thing. And so maybe it came from the research world, but it has entered into the ego world, and it's very bizarre the way that it's being treated. The way that reading recovery gets around covering up its flaws is saying that the teachers must be doing it wrong, which is very interesting because they also say that they train teachers super intensely so that they won't do it wrong. So is there a problem with your training? Is there a problem with your program? Funny enough, I looked up Reading Recovery's North American website just to build a bit of background knowledge before I made this video, and the creator, Marie Clay, has a bio on there. It's 4 pages long, 4 internet pages long. Do you know how long a bio is in the research world? 60 characters. Name, affiliation. That's it. Nobody cares about your, where you came from or why you're doing anything. Hers is 4 pages long. So she's really built this following based on who she is, not what she's doing. But here is a funny excerpt from her bio. Her challenges to current practice in preventing and recovering from literacy learning difficulties are no less relevant and urgent today than they were a decade ago. Yeah, no kidding, because you didn't fix anything. Of course you have the same problems. You didn't solve anything. You're admitting it right there in your bio. Okay, so what are the main takeaways here? Well, we need to focus less on intervention and more on prevention, because literacy gaps are an equity issue. We need to break down barriers that exist for racialized students and students who grow up in poverty. We need to offer early learning that is actual learning, so phonics-based, not whole language. There's enough research to support that. And we need to stop hoping that fancy and expensive programs are going to just fix everything for us. Don't throw money at it. This research showed that volunteers can do a better job if they just use the research that's available. All right, well, do any of your schools use reading recovery? Have you taught it and had a different experience than what this article is talking about? Do you see success in your students? How do you feel about the students who aren't successful? I want to hear all about it in the comments so that we can have a discussion and chat about this topic. Well, that is all I have for you today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please give it a like and comment down below. That helps videos like this get out there a little bit more with the YouTube algorithm. Remember to subscribe so that you can get more videos like this as well. Have a great day. Bye.